The tower on the hill behind me is now part of a holiday park. Its owners not very keen for it to be filmed. Perhaps that's because in the 1960s it was a research base for scientists preparing for the possibility of war with the Soviet Union. The war they envisaged would be fought not only with tanks and bombs, but also with deadly diseases, so-called biological weapons. To see how far these diseases could spread, the scientists used an adapted ship, the ice whale, to spray supposedly harmless organisms called simulants over Dorset and Devon.
The agent will usually be spread as a gas or an aerosol, and it's essential to know how this will behave in different terrains and weather conditions.
These organisms travelled far inland. Testing stations from Bournemouth to Newton Abbot picked up samples of bacteria sprayed by the ice whale. Here in the Dorset village of East Lulworth, people believe the organisms released in the 1960s may be far from harmless. A survey of 22 families who lived here at the time shows a high number of women went on to develop birth problems or gave birth to children who had health problems themselves.
It all adds up, basically. During the period of the trials, these girls and some of the boys were grown up in this village, and all those children seem to have gone on to have these problems that I spoke about earlier. We know of families who have moved into this village since 1978. They've gone on to have perfectly healthy children, no miscarriages, no disabilities. It only seems to have affected the children who were grown up during this trial period.
Their claims are currently being looked into by the Dorset Health Authority.
It is a very slow process, and it has to be done very carefully, very accurately, because it's important to define how big is the population we're looking at, and we still don't know yet.
There must be something, because every girl's been affected one way or the other. So, you know, one girl suffered a tragedy. Well, all the girls in the village have suffered some sort of tragedy to do with children. So there must be something that's causing it.
Due to the sheer scale of the trials, if people in East Lulworth have been affected, there could be implications for people across Dorset and East Devon. 29 files relating to the tests have now been declassified by the MOD, but the Lulworth families believe crucial questions are still being left unanswered. The Chemical and Biological Defence Establishment at Porton Down is currently run by a government agency called DERA, but the body which carried out the tests in the 1960s was called the Microbiological Research Establishment, or MRE. It was overseen by the Biological Research Advisory Board, also known as BRAB. It needed BRAB's permission for every test it carried out. For the last year, DERA has claimed that permission for the tests was given at the 51st meeting of BRAB. At that meeting, the scientist in charge of the experiments described what he intended to do.
The early warning trials would involve the release within the range of quantities of, say, 20 litres or more. Doses outside the range would be quite small. The chairman found this acceptable and the board agreed.
The minutes of that meeting described tests carried out on the ranges at Porton Down and mentioned the possibility of people outside the range breathing in the simulants used. They make no explicit mention of the trials carried out in Dorset and Devon.
We are now sitting here, decades later, looking back at the permissions that were granted, and my reading of this is that permission was granted. Now, it may well be open to another interpretation, but that's my reading of it.
Permission aside, could either of the two supposedly harmless simulants used in the trials be potentially harmful? One of them was Bacillus globigii, or BG. Although often found in the environment, it was imported from Fort Detrick, the US biological warfare plant. Despite claims that it's harmless, US forces abandoned a test with it in 1958 because they considered it a health risk to their troops. DERA themselves have admitted that it may cause disease in immunocompromised people, the very young, the very old, or the already sick.
I think you have to look at the conditions at the time and try and put yourself back into the the levels of acceptable risk that were considered to be appropriate at the time where we look at things these days. We took levels of risk then which we wouldn't dream of doing now. Now, if you're asking me, would I these days plan a series of trials of this sort without taking additional precautions, the answer is, of course, no.
E. coli MRE162 was the other simulant used in the trials. It's a different strain of E. coli to that recently associated with food poisoning in Scotland. It was tested on mice to check it wasn't toxic, but campaigners point out that these mice were not allowed to breed, so the potential to cause birth defects would have been unknown. There's also some dispute as to exactly what strain of the organism was used. The strain which the MRE claimed they used in the 1960s was recently sent to the laboratory of enteric pathogens for testing. They found that the strain was different to the one claimed by the MRE.
Can the MRE, can Dara be trusted to have sent the right organism or to have used the organism they said they used?
We certainly sent the right organism. The explanation is that the material that was tested in the 60s, the identification they were able to produce then, put it into a particular group of strains. Now we've been able to identify which specific strain it is within that group.
But that explanation is disputed by the director of the Laboratory of Enteric Pathogens.
Well, I've not seen the material that you read out that has his opinion there, and I've not discussed it with him.
Or perhaps it would bear a bit more looking into.
Perhaps it would.
Armed Forces Minister Dr. John Reid recently announced his intention to appoint an independent expert to look into the tests. It's not clear yet what his terms of reference will be, but the MOD say it's extremely unlikely he'll have the power to subpoena witnesses or documents. Campaigners here and elsewhere say they'll be satisfied only with a full public inquiry.